Saying Zionism or Zionist in the modern world is often controversial. But what does it really mean? Does it mean war, terrorism, conflict, or genocide? This video is a deep dive into Zionism, including its origins, causes, and its impact on the modern world. I hope you enjoy it, and you're watching All Things Humanities. Before unpacking the causes of Zionism, let's understand what Zionism is. Zionism is a movement that advocates for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. This means that Jewish people will have an established country to reside in. The idea is rooted in the historical and religious connection of the Jewish people to their ancestral land. Zionism draws from deep religious traditions within Judaism. For centuries, Jews maintained a connection to the land of Israel through a key belief in their religion called the covenant. In Judaism, a covenant is a fundamental agreement between God and the Jewish people. The Jews believe that the land of Canaan, which is in modern-day Israel, was promised to the Jewish people through God's covenant with Abraham. If we read the Hebrew Bible, it says in Genesis 12 that God first calls Abraham to go to the land that I will show you, promising him a great nation and a blessing to all families of the earth. Genesis also tells us that God instituted circumcision as a sign of the covenant between God and Abraham. During the ancient world, the Jewish people were scattered from their homelands. This was a result of conquests and exile known as the Jewish diaspora. In particular, it was the Babylonians and the Romans who had conquered and exiled the Jewish people, leading to a scattered Jewish population. The Jewish diaspora also involved centuries of religious persecution, economic hardship, and anti-Semitism for the Jewish people. However, persecution and discrimination against the Jewish people didn't end there. There was also an extensive persecution of Jews during the medieval world. In the early modern world, Jews experienced many waves of persecution, including the pogroms in the Russian Empire, and of course the rise of Nazism in the 20th century. This encouraged many Jews to flee their homes in search of safety and opportunity. Anti-Semitism was a big reason why many Sephardi Jews developed trade networks in the Ottoman Empire. Moreover, in much of Christian Europe, Jews were banned from owning land, and they were excluded from craft guilds. This limited their access to agriculture and skilled trades. Interestingly enough, these prohibitions encouraged Jewish people to steer towards urban commerce, finance, and money lending, and it's where stereotypes of Jews being greedy and money-hungry began to develop. Overall, anti-Semitism has a long, complex history, and if you're keen to learn more about it, please check out this video I made on the causes of anti-Semitism throughout history. I'll put the link in the description for you guys. This brings us now to Theodor Herzl, the father of modern Zionism. Herzl was an Austro-Hungarian Jewish journalist who thought that Jewish people faced a political and national crisis. Jewish people, as we've seen, have a long history of persecution and mistreatment, and Herzl thought that this could be resolved if a Jewish state were established in Palestine. This was all recorded in his book titled Der Judenstaat, translating to the Jewish state. It's important to remember that modern Zionism is not grounded in religious belief. God's promise to Abraham in Genesis is not the same as attempting to establish a nation through colonization and the mass migration of Jewish people into Canaan. Judaism teaches that God should determine whether the Jewish people return to Canaan or not. This means that God's will is responsible for the return of Canaan to the Jewish people. According to some branches of Judaism, this would occur during the Messianic age and not through human action. Judaism teaches that when the Messiah, a divinely appointed king, returns to earth, the Jewish people will gain control of Canaan and then establish Jewish law. For this reason, many Jews believe that human efforts to reoccupy Canaan are contrary to Jewish teaching and therefore illegitimate. On the other hand, Herschel's Zionism encouraged countries and Jews to achieve Jewish self-determination. This would take the form of creating an Israeli state like we saw during the mid-1900s. Herschel published The Jewish State in 1896, which provided the foundation for modern political Zionism. The pamphlet argued that Jews possessed a national identity and would never be safe from anti-Semitism unless they lived in a community where they were the majority. Before the modern Zionist movement, Palestine had a small indigenous Jewish population of approximately 25,000 people in 1880. Modern Zionist immigration began in 1882 as a political response to widespread anti-Semitism and pogroms in Eastern Europe. Between 1882 and 1903, during the First Aliyah, approximately 25,000 to 35,000 Jews, mostly from the Russian Empire, migrated to Palestine. A second wave of immigration between 1903 and 1914 brought another 35,000 to 40,000 Russian Jews in the region. By the start of World War I in 1914, Palestine's Jewish population had grown to approximately 60,000, compared to over 700,000 Muslim and Christian Arabs already in Palestine. This means that Jews represented roughly 8 to 11% of the entire population. Before Jewish migration, Palestine was an Arab-speaking, Muslim-majority society. It was an agrarian economy with traditional villages and social structures. In November 1917, the British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour issued the Balfour Declaration, which was a public statement supporting the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. This declaration was a product of very intense lobbying by Zionist advocates, particularly Chaim Weizmann, and British strategic interests in securing Jewish support during the war and establishing post-war claims to Palestine. It is lobbying of this kind that has led to resentment and frustration from Palestinian Arabs in the region. Most Arab leaders in between 1917 and 1920 viewed the Balfour Declaration as a British betrayal of wartime assurances to the Arabs that ignored the political rights of the Arab majority in Palestine. Following the Ottoman Empire's defeat, the League of Nations granted Britain the mandate for Palestine in 1922, holding Britain responsible for ensuring Jewish immigration and the establishment of a Jewish national home. This mandate made Palestine distinct from other post-World War I mandates. Its primary objective was to create conditions for a Jewish state, despite Jews comprising only less than 10% of the population. The acquisition of land was central to the Zionist strategy. The Jewish National Fund of 1901 purchased land with the stated goal of creating land ownership that could not be taken away from the Jewish people. The largest purchases came from absentee landlords, mainly Lebanese and Levantine families, who owned significant agricultural lands. The acquisition of the land by Jewish National Fund led to the eviction of Palestinian tenant farmers from several villages. By 1945, Jewish buyers had legal ownership of approximately 6% of Palestine's total land area. While this percentage seems small, the purchased lands were strategically located to secure territory for fertile regions for the Jewish people. One could argue that the Lebanese and Levantine landlords did not have to sell their lands to the Jewish people. It seemed like the Jews were able to accumulate capital through donations and then acquire land with it. Levantine landlords sold land to Zionist organizations in the 1920s and 30s because the Jews were able to offer strong above-market prices for large plots of land. It's also important to remember that these Lebanese and Levantine landlords had minimal personal attachment to the lands they owned and made them more willing to sell. The Arabs became conspiratorial about this because the British Mandate property laws made it easier to transfer large estates. This suggests that the Jews may have been working with the British to achieve land acquisition in Palestine. The fundamental problem with Zionism was that existing Arab populations experienced mass displacement, village destruction, loss of property, and social fragmentation. Conflicts between the Arabs and the Jews were inevitable. Two groups of people were and still are competing for control over the same land. Much of the fighting in Israel today centers on ensuring control and security over the original lands of Canaan. The religious dimension of Zionism cannot be ignored either. In Islam, Jerusalem is very important for Muslims because it is the site of Muhammad's night journey to Al-Masjid al-Aqsa. For this reason, the Quran calls the region a holy land. Since the late 20th century, Islam has increasingly shaped Palestinian identity and also resistance. Groups such as Hamas explicitly describe Palestine as an Islamic sacred trust that must remain under Muslim stewardship and forbids its permanent cession to non-Muslims. In other words, it forbids Jewish occupation. Their ideology links political freedom with religious obligation, framing the struggle against Zionism as a form of holy war to restore divine justice. At its core, Zionism is motivated by tribalism, the Jewish need of being free from persecution, and also the economic prosperity of the Jews. Zionism aims to ensure that a state is created for Jewish people to reside in. At the same time, this does not mean that only Jewish people can live in Israel. Nevertheless, Zionism is the idea that Jews should have a homeland in Palestine and was driven by rampant anti-Semitism in Europe. If anti-Semitism was not so prevalent, the need for a Jewish homeland in Palestine would not be as necessary. After all, what motivation would there be to colonize the ancient land of Canaan? We've already seen in this video that Judaism does not advocate for Zionism through political actions. The motivations stem from higher levels of anti-Semitism. Thus, Zionism provided an outlet for persecuted Jews and an opportunity to live autonomously without persecution. Unfortunately, when the Jewish allies began arriving in the 1800s and 1900s, the Arabs were displaced. While many Jews were prospering from their migration to Palestine, it did come at the cost of many Arabs living in the region. Arab rejection of Zionism stemmed from several factors. The Arabs opposed the Jewish right of return because they rejected using biblical claims for political purposes. Once again, modern Zionism is a political goal and it is not supported by Judaism. The Palestinian Arabs argued that Zionism meant that they would lose possession of their land. Modern discussions of Zionism must navigate the interests of both the Arabs and the Jews and their respective land interests. The idea of one power invading another and taking control over land is not a new phenomenon in human history. If we look at Australian history, for example, Australia was colonized by the British and the First Nations people suffered immensely for it. Zionism achieved its primary goal with the establishment of Israel in the 1940s, leading to a demographic shift where Israel now hosts roughly 40% of the world's Jewish population. The movement represents a unique historical example of a nation being re-established after nearly 2,000 years of diaspora. The concept remains central to Israeli identity and politics, with most Israeli political parties continuing to define themselves as Zionist. But that brings us to the end of this video on Zionism. I hope you found it interesting and you enjoyed it. If you did, consider subscribing and liking the video for more content like this.